When my own children announced that I should move into the basement because the upstairs is for guests, I felt a humiliation so deep it's hard to put into words. They tucked me away like an unwanted item, like a living reminder of an inconvenient old age. While they hosted dinners upstairs, laughing and forgetting I even existed, I was making my own plans. Plans that would turn their lives and their faces upside down the moment they discovered whose name had been on the deed to this house from the very beginning. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Martha Lynch. I was 67 years old when I packed the last box of my belongings into the back of my son's pickup truck and left behind the house that had been my home for nearly 40 years. I had been a librarian most of my life in Springfield, Illinois, a small, tidy town where everyone knew everyone else's business, but still managed to leave each other alone enough to breathe. After Harold passed away 3 years ago, the house had grown too big, too quiet, too full of echoes that belonged to another time. At first, moving in with Adam, my only son, seemed like the natural thing to do. He and his wife, Lindsay, lived just across town in a 2-story colonial they had bought a few years back. They had 3 bedrooms upstairs, a finished basement, a big backyard with a vegetable garden Lindsay half-heartedly tended when she remembered. They insisted that having me live with them would be good for everyone. I would be close by. I wouldn't have to manage the upkeep of my old house alone. I would be family, woven into the fabric of their daily lives once more. I wanted to believe them. I told myself that Harold would have agreed. I told myself that it was better than living alone, better than feeling like a ghost drifting through the empty rooms of a house built for a life that no longer existed. When Adam and Lindsay came over that afternoon to help me pack, their energy was brisk, efficient. Lindsay barked out instructions, stacking boxes and wrapping dishes, while Adam busied himself in the garage, sorting through my late husband's tools. I moved slowly, touching every object before I placed it into a box. The faded photographs, the threadbare quilts, the brittle pages of old books I couldn't bear to part with. Every item carried a memory, and with each memory came the sharp sting of leaving a life behind. We finished by dusk. Adam loaded the last box into the truck and clapped me on the shoulder like a comrade in arms. Lindsay smiled thinly and promised me that I was going to love the new arrangement. I nodded, smiling back with a tightness in my chest I could not name. The drive to their house was silent, except for the occasional rattle of something shifting in the truck bed. I stared out the window at the familiar streets blurring past, feeling like a passenger, not just in the truck, but in my own life. When we arrived, Adam backed the truck into their driveway, and Lindsay hurried up the front steps to unlock the door. Their 2 kids, Jessica and Noah, waved from the living room couch, their attention barely flickering from the screens in their hands. I smiled at them, but they hardly noticed. The first sign that something was wrong came when Lindsay led me not up the stairs to the guest room, but down a narrow set of steps into the basement. "I know it's not what we originally talked about," she said, her voice breezy as she flicked on the light, "but we figured it would give you more privacy. Plus, we've got friends coming to stay next month, and it just makes sense to keep the upstairs free for guests." I stood there, staring at the space that was supposed to be my new home. It wasn't a finished basement like they had described. It was a cluttered, cold storage area crammed with plastic bins, rusted workout equipment, and boxes of holiday decorations. A cot had been set up in one corner, covered with a thin blanket and a single flat pillow. An old armchair leaned drunkenly against one wall, and a small metal shelf had been cleared off for my things. There was no window, save for a small, grimy pane near the ceiling that let in barely enough light to distinguish night from day. The air smelled faintly of damp concrete and mildew. The only bathroom was a half bath tucked into a corner, the sink chipped and the faucet dripping steadily into the cracked basin. I opened my mouth to say something, to ask if this was truly what they had in mind, but Lindsay had already turned and bustled back up the stairs, calling over her shoulder about dinner being ready soon. Adam lingered awkwardly for a moment, scratching the back of his neck. "It's just for now," he said, not quite meeting my eyes, "until we figure out something better." I nodded, swallowing down the thick knot in my throat. I didn't trust myself to speak. I spent the rest of the evening unpacking what few things I could fit onto the metal shelf and into the small chest of drawers they had provided. I unfolded the thin blanket over the cot and sat down heavily, the springs groaning beneath me. Upstairs, I could hear the clatter of dishes, the low hum of conversation, the occasional burst of laughter. I sat in the dim, musty basement and listened to the life of the house unfold above me, feeling like an intruder in a life that had once been mine. When Lindsay called down that dinner was ready, I climbed the stairs slowly, my knees aching with each step. We ate at the long dining room table I had bought them as a housewarming gift years ago. Lindsay chatted about Jessica's piano lessons and Noah's soccer games. Adam nodded along, adding the occasional comment about work or weekend plans. They spoke around me, over me, never really to me. I pushed my food around my plate and smiled when appropriate. I nodded when they expected agreement. I laughed when the moment demanded it. But inside, something was splintering. After dinner, I retreated back down to the basement. I closed the door behind me and sat on the cot, staring at the bare concrete wall. I thought about Harold, about the home we had built together, the life we had shared. I thought about the promises we had made to each other, to our son, that family meant something, that it was sacred, unbreakable. I pulled the blanket around my shoulders and lay down, the chill of the concrete floor bleeding up through the thin mattress. Above me, life continued on. Above me, I was already being forgotten. And somewhere deep inside, a seed of resolve began to take root. I didn't know then exactly what I would do, but I knew one thing with absolute clarity. I would not spend the rest of my days buried beneath someone else's life like a secret shame. The basement became my world. Each morning, I woke to the same dim gray light filtering through the tiny window near the ceiling, a weak reminder that life continued somewhere above me. The air was always damp, always heavy, clinging to my skin and seeping into my bones, no matter how many sweaters I layered over myself. I kept a small space heater near the cot, humming through the night, but it did little against the cold that seemed stitched into the very walls. I tried in the beginning to make the space feel like home. I placed a few framed photographs on the crooked shelf, one of Harold and me on our wedding day, one of Adam as a baby swaddled in blue. I folded my sweaters neatly into the plastic drawers Lindsay had bought from a discount store. I pinned a quilt along the exposed pipes to soften the harshness of the cinder block walls. None of it helped. The basement was a place for forgotten things, and now, it seemed, I was one of them. Upstairs, life carried on. I heard it every day. The heavy footsteps running across the hardwood floors, the opening and slamming of cabinet doors, the burst of laughter from the kitchen when the television played some sitcom rerun. They almost never called for me. Sometimes, if I lingered too long in the upstairs hallway after using the bathroom or passing through the kitchen, Lindsay would glance up with a polite, strained smile and remind me, in her overly sweet tone, that they had a full house today or that the kids needed their space. I learned quickly. I kept to the basement. I built small routines to occupy my days. I would wake early, stretch the stiffness from my legs, make a cup of instant coffee with the kettle Adam plugged in for me. I read old library books by the single lamp that flickered if I leaned too hard against the wall. I crocheted long strips of fabric, mindless patterns that filled the empty hours. Occasionally, I tried to write letters to old friends, but the words felt hollow, performative. I tore up more drafts than I ever mailed. Meals became another silent ritual. Lindsay would leave a plate for me at the top of the basement stairs, covered in plastic wrap, cooling and congealing by the time I found it. No one sat with me. No one asked if I needed anything more. I would carry the plate downstairs, eat in silence, and scrape the remnants into a small trash can tucked behind the folding table that served as my desk. Sometimes I heard them hosting guests, neighbors, co-workers, friends from the kids' schools. Their voices floated down through the floorboards, bright and animated. They laughed, told stories, clinked glasses together in celebration. They never once invited me to join them, not even out of courtesy. Once, curious and desperate, I crept up the basement stairs, cracked the door an inch, and peeked into the glowing warmth of the living room. I watched as Lindsay poured wine into delicate stemmed glasses, as Adam slapped a friend on the back and joked about the peace and quiet of their home. I waited for someone to remember I was there. No one did. I closed the door quietly and descended back into the cold. Nights were the hardest. The cot creaked under my weight. The pipes above me moaned and rattled with the evening's showers and flushing toilets. I lay awake for hours sometimes, staring at the shadowed ceiling, listening to the thrum of the world above me, trying to remember that once, a long time ago, I had been someone important in this house. I thought often of Harold. I thought of the promises we made to each other, the dreams we built brick by brick. I thought of how proud we had been the day we paid off the last of the mortgage, standing together on the porch with glasses of cheap champagne, the world wide open before us. And now I lived in a basement, unseen and uninvited. There were days I doubted myself, wondered if I was being too sensitive, too proud. Maybe this was just the way of things. Maybe the world moved on, and the old ones simply had to step aside, make room for new lives, new stories. But then I would catch the careful way Lindsay avoided meeting my eyes, the way Adam rushed through conversations with me, guilt tucked into the corners of his mouth, and I knew it wasn't just in my head. They had made a place for me, a place out of sight, a place that was easy to forget. I tried to make myself useful. I folded their laundry when I found it piled at the foot of the basement stairs. I cleaned the muddy shoes left outside the back door. I clipped coupons and left them neatly stacked on the kitchen counter. None of it seemed to matter. If anything, it seemed to embarrass them, like my existence was an inconvenience they had agreed to tolerate only under strict terms. One afternoon, I overheard Lindsay talking on the phone with a friend. "Well, you know how it is," she said, laughing lightly. "Having her here is, well, it's not ideal, but at least she's out of the way." Out of the way. The words lodged in my chest like a splinter I couldn't remove. That evening, I sat on the cot holding Harold's photo in my lap, tracing the edge of the frame with my thumb. I whispered into the cold air, not expecting an answer. "What would you have me do, Harold?" The photo offered no wisdom, no comfort, only my own voice echoed back to me. I realized then that waiting for them to see me, to value me, to treat me like something more than an obligation, was a waste of time I no longer had to spare. I was 67 years old. I had buried my husband, raised a son, built a life from scratch. I would not end it rotting away in a basement. Something inside me shifted that night, subtle but irreversible. The basement had been their choice, but what came next would be mine. The first time they hosted guests after I moved in, I heard about it not from Adam or Lindsay, but from the noise that filled the house in the early evening hours. I had been downstairs, reading the same paragraph of a book over and over, unable to concentrate, when the sharp clatter of plates and the squeak of the front door reached me through the thin basement ceiling. Chairs scraped against the hardwood, high-pitched laughter punctuated the air, and the unmistakable pop of a champagne cork echoed through the floor joists. Curious and hopeful, I folded my book shut and climbed halfway up the basement stairs, careful not to make noise. I stood behind the closed door and listened. I could hear Lindsay's voice, warm and lilting, welcoming her guests. Adam's laughter followed, easy and familiar. Other voices chimed in. Some I recognized from neighborhood gatherings, others I did not. I waited, heart beating faster than it should have, for the sound of my name, for someone to call down to say, "Mom, come join us." The call never came. Instead, I heard Lindsay explaining that the upstairs was freshly redecorated for their guests, that everything had been arranged perfectly, that they had plenty of room now. Her voice was proud, smooth, polished like a salesperson showing off a model home. I descended the steps quietly, each one a little heavier than the last, and closed myself back into the cold hum of the basement. I made myself a cup of instant coffee, even though I wasn't thirsty. I held the mug in both hands, letting the warmth seep into my palms. I sat on the cot, staring at the cracked wall, while upstairs the party roared. It became a pattern. Week after week, the doorbell rang and new voices entered the house. Each time, I would listen as the music floated down, as the laughter grew loud and tipsy, as chairs shifted and dishes clinked. I never went up. I never intruded. I learned to recognize the different groups, the neighbors who liked to gossip about the homeowners association, the coworkers who joked loudly about office politics, the parents from the children's school who talked about soccer tournaments and piano recitals. Not once was I invited to join. I became an invisible tenant, a ghost in my own son's home. One evening, while balancing a basket of folded laundry, I happened to glance out the narrow basement window. Through the sliver of glass, I saw Lindsay in the backyard, lighting tiki torches around the patio, her blonde hair catching the last golden rays of the setting sun. A long table had been set up, draped in crisp white linen, scattered with small candles in mason jars. Guests began to filter into the yard carrying plates piled with food. Children ran barefoot across the grass, shrieking with laughter. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass and watched them. I saw Adam walking among them, handing out drinks, smiling in a way I hadn't seen directed at me in years. I saw Lindsay tossing her head back at a joke, her hand resting lightly on the arm of a man I didn't recognize. I saw Jessica and Noah chasing bubbles blown from a little plastic machine near the fence. It looked like something out of a magazine, a perfect summer gathering, and I was nowhere in it. It wasn't that they had forgotten me. It was that they had intentionally designed a life where I no longer fit. The realization was cold and sharp, slicing through whatever tattered remnants of hope I had clung to since the move. At some point during the evening, a woman I recognized from the neighborhood, the one who always wore loud floral prints and too much perfume, leaned in close to Lindsay, laughing loudly. Through the window, I caught a few words carried by the breeze. It's so smart of you to keep things neat upstairs, she said. I can't imagine having, well, older folks underfoot all the time. Lindsay laughed, not loudly but not softly either. A smooth, complicit sound. They're happy where they are, she said. It's better for everyone. I stepped back from the window as if I had been slapped. Happy where they are. Better for everyone. I sat down heavily on the low stool near the laundry basket and stared at my hands. Hands that had changed diapers, packed lunches, stitched Halloween costumes, soothed fevered brows. Hands that had built a life from nothing, alongside a husband who had loved me beyond reason. Hands that now shook, just slightly, with the effort of staying still. I stayed in the basement the entire evening. I didn't eat dinner. I didn't even turn on the light. I just sat there in the dimness, listening to the thrum of the party, the laughter, the clink of glasses. It would be easy, I thought, to let this bitterness consume me, to let it erode the parts of me that had fought so hard to stay kind, to stay gentle. But bitterness was a prison of its own, one I refused to inhabit. I would not become a prisoner in this basement, not in my body, not in my mind. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply, listening to my own heartbeat, steady and stubborn. Let them have their parties. Let them celebrate their freedom from obligation. I would find a different freedom, one that didn't depend on their invitations, their recognition, their validation. That night, after the guests had gone and the house fell silent again, I opened the small metal filing cabinet that sat in the far corner of the basement. Inside were old documents, bank statements, insurance papers, deeds. I ran my fingers across the thin file folders, feeling the rough texture of possibility. There, tucked between Harold's pension paperwork and a bundle of old tax returns, was the deed to the house, my name, only my name, a tiny flicker of power, buried for years, ignited in my chest. They thought the upstairs was for guests. They thought the basement was enough for me. They didn't know whose house they were standing in, but they were about to find out. The next morning, I woke before the sun, the basement still heavy with the lingering dampness of the night. I sat up slowly on the cot, the cold seeping through the thin mattress into my bones, and for a long moment, I simply listened. Above me, the house remained quiet, the heavy silence of a sleeping world. The echo of last night's laughter still clung to the walls, but it felt distant now, like the memory of a life that no longer belonged to me. I pulled a sweater over my shoulders, slipped on my shoes, and crossed the room to the metal filing cabinet. My fingers hesitated on the small, rusty handle before I pulled it open. The cabinet groaned in protest, the drawer sticking halfway before finally giving way. A musty smell of old paper and dust rose up, sharp and dry. I flipped through the contents carefully. Most of it was exactly what I remembered. Bank statements from years gone by, insurance forms, tax returns that Harold had meticulously filed away. My heart squeezed a little as I touched the familiar loops of his handwriting on the labels, each folder named with precision and care. And then I found it. Tucked into a worn manila envelope, yellowed with age, was the deed to the house. I pulled it out with trembling fingers and laid it flat on the small folding table near my cot. The paper was thick, the ink slightly faded, but the words were still clear enough to read. My name, only my name, no mention of Adam, no mention of Lindsay, no co-ownership, no second signature. It was mine. The realization settled over me slowly, not like a bolt of lightning, but like the steady filling of a well that had been dry for too long. I stared at the document, letting the weight of it sink into my skin, into my bones. They had moved me into the basement. They had treated me like an afterthought. They had hosted parties, toasted new friendships, laughed under the roof that Harold and I had built with our dreams and our sacrifices. And they had done it all without realizing that they were standing on ground that did not belong to them. I spent the rest of the morning going through every document I could find. I cross-referenced dates, double-checked signatures. I found the original mortgage paperwork, the discharge notice declaring the loan paid in full, the home insurance policies, all bearing my name alone. I found Harold's will tucked safely in another envelope, where he had reaffirmed that everything he had, including the house, would pass to me and me alone. No loopholes, no technicalities. They had no claim. The sun had fully risen by the time I finished, the narrow basement window casting a thin line of light across the table. I sat back in the rickety chair, hands folded loosely in my lap, and stared at the neat stacks of papers. For so long, I had convinced myself that the walls were closing in because I had nowhere else to go, no other choices to make. I had let the fear of loneliness, of being a burden, dictate the boundaries of my life. But the truth was simpler and much harder to swallow. I had given away my power without even realizing it. Now, with these documents in hand, I understood something I should have known all along. My life, my home, my dignity, they were mine to protect. No one else had the right to decide what corner of the world I deserved to occupy. No one else had the authority to move me like a piece of unwanted furniture, to shove me out of sight. For the first time in months, a slow, stubborn fire began to build in my chest. It wasn't rage. It wasn't even sadness. It was clarity. Cold, clean, undeniable. I would not stay in the basement. I would not spend another day listening to laughter I wasn't invited to share, watching dinners I wasn't welcome to attend, enduring pity disguised as tolerance. I would not wait for them to remember I was there. I stood up from the table, feeling taller than I had in months, and gathered the documents carefully. I placed them in a large manila folder and slid the folder into the old tote bag I kept by the stairs. There was work to do, calls to make, decisions to finalize. This was my house, and if Adam and Lindsay thought they could shuffle me into the shadows and claim the light for themselves, they were about to learn a lesson they would never forget. I climbed the basement stairs, my tote bag swinging against my hip. The door to the main floor was closed, as always, but I reached out and opened it without hesitation. The house smelled like coffee and toast. I could hear the low murmur of the television from the living room. Life was unfolding above me, as it always had, indifferent to my presence. But I was no longer indifferent to theirs. I crossed the kitchen quietly, unnoticed, and stepped out onto the front porch. The morning was brisk, the air filled with the crisp scent of fallen leaves. I stood there for a moment, breathing it in, feeling the sun warm my face. And then I walked down the steps, out to the sidewalk, and down the street toward the town center, toward my new beginning, toward my rightful place. Each step forward felt lighter, stronger, fueled by the knowledge that I wasn't powerless. I had simply forgotten how much power I still held, until now. The town center looked different than I remembered. Or maybe it was just me who had changed. The brick sidewalks were still uneven, cracked here and there by the relentless push of tree roots. The storefronts still wore their faded awnings like badges of honor, proud survivors of too many Illinois winters. The old clock tower still presided over Main Street, its hands stubbornly accurate despite the rust creeping along its face. I walked slowly, savoring the feel of the cool morning air brushing against my skin. Every step away from the house felt like peeling away another layer of shame, another burden I had carried too long. By the time I reached the small real estate office tucked between the bakery and the hardware store, I felt almost weightless. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and lemon-scented cleaner. A bell jingled as I pushed the door open. A woman looked up from behind a cluttered desk and smiled warmly, her reading glasses slipping down her nose. Her name tag read Deborah. I introduced myself, my voice steady, and explained that I wanted to discuss selling my home, not the house I lived in, not the house my son owned. My home. Deborah listened without interruption, her smile never faltering. She pulled out a notepad and began to ask the necessary questions. Square footage, age of the roof, recent repairs. I answered mechanically, the details pouring out of me as if I had rehearsed them in my mind 1,000 times. When we finished, she leaned back in her chair, tapping her pen thoughtfully against her clipboard. You know, she said, homes like yours don't stay on the market long these days, especially in that neighborhood. We could have offers by the end of the week. Offers. The word hung in the air between us, heavy with possibility. For a brief moment, a flicker of doubt passed through me. Was I really going to do this? Was I really prepared to uproot not just my life, but theirs? Would Adam hate me? Would Lindsay call me cruel? Would the grandchildren even understand? But then I thought of the basement. I thought of the dinner plates left at the top of the stairs, like offerings to a forgotten ghost. I thought of the muffled laughter floating down from the parties I was never invited to. I thought of the way Lindsay's voice sounded when she told her friend I was out of the way. And I thought of Harold. He would have never wanted this for me. He would have never built a life for us, only to have me tucked away like something to be ashamed of. I looked at Deborah and nodded. Let's do it, I said. We spent the next hour going over paperwork. Deborah explained the process patiently, guiding me through the documents I needed to sign, the steps that would follow. She promised to schedule a photographer to take pictures of the house, to arrange showings discreetly if I preferred. I told her I wanted everything done quietly, but quickly. I didn't want to give Adam or Lindsay time to maneuver, to guilt me into changing my mind. I had made too many decisions in my life based on fear and obligation. This one would be different. This one would be for me. After I signed the final form, Deborah slid a packet of copies across the desk to me and shook my hand firmly. You're doing the right thing, she said, her voice low and certain. I left the office feeling strangely calm, not triumphant, not giddy, just sure. As I walked back toward the house, the tote bag heavy with paperwork swinging against my hip, I mapped out the next steps in my mind. First, I would speak to a lawyer to make sure everything was airtight. Second, I would find a small, comfortable place to live, somewhere with real windows and sunlight and neighbors who waved hello. Third, I would pack only what I needed. The rest, the memories, the regrets, the spaces where I had once belonged, I would leave behind. When I reached the house, I paused on the sidewalk, looking up at the windows. From the outside, it looked so ordinary, so unchanged. No one passing by would ever guess at the undercurrents of betrayal and hurt that lived within those walls. I climbed the steps slowly and entered through the front door without knocking. It was my home after all. The house was quiet. Adam must have been at work. Lindsay's car was gone. The children were at school. I moved through the rooms methodically, taking note of what was truly mine. The grandfather clock in the hallway that had belonged to my father. The oak dining table Harold and I had saved for years to buy. The quilts I had stitched by hand during long winter evenings. Most of the furniture, the appliances, the electronics, they could have them. Let them try to fill the empty shell with new things. It wouldn't change what it meant to lose the foundation beneath their feet. In the kitchen, I placed the real estate documents neatly on the counter, weighted down by a ceramic rooster Adam had made in second grade, a quiet symbol of the beginning of the end. I returned to the basement, feeling lighter with every step. I spent the rest of the day preparing. I sorted through my clothes, setting aside only what I loved. I packed the photo albums, the letters, the little keepsakes that mattered. I ignored the rest. The broken exercise bike, the boxes of outdated holiday decorations, the remnants of a life that no longer fit me. As the sun set, casting long orange shadows through the tiny basement window, I sat on the cot and let the quiet wash over me. I thought there would be sadness. I thought there would be fear. Instead, there was only peace. I had made my decision, and for the first time in a long time, it was mine alone. The days that followed moved with a strange, quiet momentum. There was a kind of detached rhythm to it, as if I were merely watching the world from a distance, observing my own actions like a bystander. I continued to go about my routines downstairs in the basement, but each small task now carried a different weight. Each folded shirt, each emptied drawer, each cleared shelf was a step closer to the life I was reclaiming. Deborah worked quickly. She arranged for a photographer to come by midweek. On the morning of the appointment, I made sure to be out of the house. I sat at the small coffee shop downtown, nursing a black coffee that grew cold long before I finished it, flipping idly through a local newspaper I had no real interest in. I imagined the photographer moving through the house, capturing the bright living room windows, the shining kitchen countertops, the tidy front yard that Harold and I had once tended together with such pride. By the end of the week, the listing went live. I saw it first on Deborah's office window, a glossy photo of the house staring back at me from behind the glass. There was no mention of the family living inside, no hint of the woman sleeping in a basement, the woman who still knew where every squeaky floorboard and sticking door latch lay hidden. Just bright rooms, fresh paint, an opportunity for the right buyer. It made my chest ache, but not in the way I had expected. It wasn't sadness, it wasn't loss. It was a clean, necessary ache, like pulling out a thorn and watching the blood well up, knowing the wound would heal cleaner now that the poison was gone. Within 2 days, the first offers arrived. Deborah called me late one afternoon as I sat outside the library, the tote bag with my papers resting beside me on the bench. Her voice buzzed with excitement. "Multiple offers," she said, "above asking price." I closed my eyes and let the information settle. It felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, the wind whipping at my hair, and knowing that the only way forward was to leap. I told her to accept the best offer. The paperwork was drafted within hours. The house was under contract. I moved through the next steps with deliberate calm. I met with a lawyer to ensure the sale would proceed without interference. I had the remaining utilities transferred. I scheduled movers to collect the small amount of furniture and belongings I intended to keep. All the while, Adam and Lindsay remained oblivious to the storm gathering beneath their feet. They had built their lives so carefully around the illusion of ownership. They had wrapped themselves in entitlement so tightly they never once considered that the foundation could crumble. The closing date was set, less than 30 days away. I marked it on the calendar that hung by the basement stairs, a small red circle drawn neatly around a day that would change everything. In the meantime, I played my role. I smiled when Lindsay passed me in the kitchen. I murmured polite greetings to Adam when he came home from work. I listened to the children's chatter as they raced up and down the stairs, their backpacks thudding against the walls. None of them suspected a thing. It felt strange, moving invisibly through their lives, carrying the knowledge of what was coming like a secret talisman against the loneliness that had once crushed me. There was power in it, but there was also sorrow. No matter how much anger I had carried, no matter how much humiliation I had swallowed, there had been love once, a deep, complicated love that no betrayal could entirely erase. But love could not save me. Only truth could. And the truth was that I did not belong in a basement, forgotten and disregarded. The truth was that I had built this life, this home, with my own two hands, and I had the right to choose what came next. The night before the closing, I sat alone in the backyard, wrapped in a heavy sweater, watching the stars prick the darkening sky. The house loomed behind me, its windows glowing softly in the night, the sounds of television laughter filtering through the open windows. I thought about all the years Harold and I had spent dreaming under these same stars, planning a future we had believed would always include family, always include love, and maybe it still did. But that love had changed. It had grown teeth. It had learned how to protect itself. The next morning, I woke before dawn. I packed the last of my things into the small suitcases I had lined up by the door. I folded the final quilt, the one my mother had stitched by hand when I was still a girl, and placed it carefully into the top of the bag. When Adam came downstairs, groggy and scratching his head, I was already dressed, already ready. He blinked at the suitcases, confused. "Going somewhere, Mom?" he asked, his voice thick with sleep. I smiled, a small private smile meant only for me. "Yes," I said simply. I left before Lindsay or the children woke up. I didn't need a confrontation. I didn't need tears or accusations or last-minute apologies born more from panic than from any real understanding. I needed freedom. I needed peace. I needed to walk away on my own terms. At the closing, Deborah met me at the lawyer's office with a stack of papers ready for my signature. The buyer, a young couple expecting their first child, shook my hand warmly, their faces bright with excitement and hope. They saw the house as a beginning, not an ending. I found comfort in that. I signed my name on the final line with a steady hand. Martha Lynch, homeowner, and now former homeowner. I slid the pen across the table, leaned back in my chair, and exhaled. The house was no longer mine, and in losing it, I had finally reclaimed myself. The morning of my departure arrived with a gray, muted sky hanging low over the rooftops, the kind of sky that promises rain but never quite delivers. I woke earlier than usual, my body rising from the thin cot in the basement almost on instinct, as if it knew that something final was about to happen. The air was damp and cool, and for the first time in months, it did not feel oppressive. It felt expectant, as if even the basement walls were holding their breath. I moved quietly, gathering the last few items I had decided to take with me. A small suitcase packed with clothes, a box containing photo albums, and Harold's old wristwatch, a canvas tote filled with my favorite books. Everything else I had left behind without regret. The dusty exercise equipment, the broken lamp, the boxes of holiday decorations that had long lost their meaning, they were no longer my burden. I took one final walk through the basement, my footsteps echoing softly against the concrete floor. I paused at the small window near the ceiling, staring out at the slice of gray sky beyond it. That window had been my only view of the world for far too long. Now it would watch over someone else, or perhaps be sealed shut entirely. It no longer mattered. I zipped up the suitcase and hauled it toward the stairs. Each step I climbed felt lighter, as if with every footfall, I was shedding the weight that had pinned me down for so many months. When I reached the top, I didn't hesitate. I pushed open the door and stepped into the main floor of the house. The house was silent, the stillness of early morning thick in the air. I could smell coffee brewing, the automatic timer dutifully starting without fanfare. A plate of muffins sat on the kitchen counter, likely prepared by Lindsay the night before for the children's breakfast. I paused in the doorway, looking around at the house that had once been a symbol of hope and now stood as a monument to everything that had gone wrong. I didn't linger. I wheeled my suitcase to the front door and set it down carefully. Then I returned to the kitchen, pulled a small notepad from the drawer where Lindsay kept pens and scrap paper, and scribbled a short note. It wasn't an explanation. It wasn't an apology. It was simply a statement of fact. I'm leaving. Take care of yourselves. I folded the note neatly and placed it beneath the ceramic rooster Adam had made in elementary school, the same one I had used to hold down the real estate papers, a fitting sentinel to stand over my final words. I returned to the front door and opened it slowly. The hinges creaked, a sound that once would have driven Harold to reach for his toolbox. I smiled faintly at the memory and stepped out onto the porch. The street was empty, the world still shaking off the last threads of sleep. The sky overhead remained heavy and gray, but there was a kind of beauty in it, a softness that suited the moment. I paused for a moment on the porch, my hand resting lightly on the railing. I looked out at the yard, where Harold had once planted tulips along the walkway, where Adam had played with toy trucks in the dirt, where so many summer evenings had ended with lemonade and laughter. It wasn't mine anymore. And strangely, that realization didn't hurt. I walked down the steps, my suitcase bumping softly behind me. I didn't look back at the house. I didn't need to. I had carried it with me for too long already. Now, it was time to carry myself. At the end of the driveway, a cab idled, waiting to take me to my new apartment on the other side of town. The driver, a young man with a kind face, hopped out to help me with my bags. I thanked him and slid into the back seat, the worn vinyl sticking slightly to my legs. As the cab pulled away, I watched the house recede in the rearview mirror. It looked smaller somehow, shabbier, the paint a little more faded, the windows a little more clouded, or maybe it had always been that way, and I had only now learned to see it clearly. I leaned back against the seat and closed my eyes, letting the hum of the engine and the gentle sway of the ride soothe me. My heart was pounding, but it was not a fearful pounding. It was the steady drumbeat of freedom. The city streets began to change around me. The manicured lawns gave way to narrow side streets lined with brick apartment buildings, small cafes, and corner stores. Life bustled here in a different way, a less curated, more honest rhythm. When we reached my new building, the cab driver helped me unload my bags. I tipped him generously and stood for a moment on the sidewalk, staring up at the old brick facade of the apartment complex. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't new, but it was mine. Every inch of it would be a testament to the choice I had made to reclaim my life. I dragged my suitcase through the front door and up one flight of stairs to my new apartment. The key turned easily in the lock, and when I stepped inside, I was greeted by the clean, empty smell of fresh paint and possibility. The space was small but bright. Two large windows let in the muted morning light, and a little balcony overlooked a courtyard where an old oak tree stretched its branches toward the sky. I set my bags down in the middle of the room and stood there for a long moment, simply breathing. This was my new beginning, not a basement, not an afterthought, not a burden tucked away out of sight. A home, a life built on my own terms. I moved slowly through the apartment, running my hand along the counters, the door frames, the window sills. I imagined where I would place my favorite chair, where I would hang Harold's photograph, where I would stack my beloved books. I smiled then, a real smile, deep and unforced. I was no longer waiting for someone else to give me a place at the table. I had built my own table, and I would sit at it, alone if necessary, proud and unafraid. The rain finally began to fall outside, a soft, steady patter against the windows. I made a cup of tea, wrapped myself in the old quilt from the basement, and sat by the window watching the world wash clean. I wasn't lost. I wasn't abandoned. I wasn't forgotten. I was free. The first few days in my new apartment moved slowly, like a river thawing after a long, hard winter. There was a stillness to the space, a kind of waiting, as if the walls were holding their breath along with me. I unpacked one box at a time, careful and deliberate, choosing where every object would live, not out of obligation or routine, but because each piece deserved a place where it was wanted. I hung the photograph of Harold in the small living room first. I placed it on the mantel above the little faux fireplace, arranging it so that the morning light from the windows would fall across his smiling face. I whispered a soft hello to him every morning as I passed, not out of loneliness, but out of comfort. It made the place feel less like a blank canvas and more like a home. The days began to take shape around simple pleasures. I walked to the corner cafe every morning, a 5-minute stroll through tree-lined streets where the neighbors smiled and nodded, even if they didn't know my name yet. I always ordered a plain coffee and a blueberry muffin and sat by the window, reading the newspaper or jotting notes in a journal I had picked up from the little bookstore on Main Street. I had not written anything for years, but now the words seemed to spill out of me, slow and steady, like water finding a long-lost path. I made friends in the quiet, unhurried way that real friendships are often made. There was Evelyn, who ran the flower shop downstairs and always wore a different pair of bright, clashing earrings. There was Mr. Peterson, who tended the community garden across the street and insisted I take home fresh tomatoes and basil every Saturday. There was Clara, a widow a few years younger than me, who invited me to join her for movie nights at the community center. I said yes to everything. I had spent too long saying no, retreating into myself, folding into the spaces where I was allowed to exist. Now, every yes felt like a small rebellion, a declaration that I was here, that I deserved to be seen, heard, and known. I enrolled in a ceramics class at the local arts center. The first time I pressed my hands into the cool, wet clay, I felt a thrill of unfamiliar joy. The bowl I made was lopsided and cracked at the rim, but I kept it proudly on my kitchen counter anyway, a reminder that perfection was no longer my goal. Living was. I started hosting small dinners in my apartment, nothing elaborate, just a pot of stew, a loaf of fresh bread, a bottle of wine. Friends would gather around my small dining table, their laughter filling the room in a way that felt genuine, easy, without the heavy expectations that had once hung over every interaction in my old house. I even adopted a cat, a gray tabby from the animal shelter who had been overlooked for months because of his age and a slight limp. I named him Jasper, and he quickly claimed the sunny windowsill as his throne, watching the world with sleepy, contented eyes. In the quiet hours, I sometimes thought about Adam and Lindsay. I wondered how they reacted when they found the house empty, the note sitting beneath the ceramic rooster. I wondered what they told the children, what stories they crafted to explain my absence. A part of me still hurt when I thought of them, when I remembered the boy Adam had once been, the one who had clung to my hand on the first day of kindergarten, the one who had cried when he lost his first tooth, the one who had once whispered that he would always take care of me. But I had learned that love, real love, could not survive on memories alone. It needed presence, it needed respect, and it needed choice. I had chosen myself, and in doing so, I had given myself a second chance. One afternoon, as autumn deepened and the leaves burned gold and crimson on the trees, I stood on my little balcony with a cup of tea in hand. Jasper sprawled at my feet, purring softly. The sun slanted low across the courtyard, catching the last sparks of summer warmth. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply. There was no guilt weighing on my chest, no fear clinging to my bones, only the quiet, steady beat of my own heart, stronger than I had remembered it could be. I was not the woman they had left behind. I was not the burden they had tucked away out of sight. I was not the basement ghost they had forgotten. I was Martha Lynch, 70 years old, still standing, still dreaming, still living. A woman who had walked away from the walls that tried to close her in and had built new walls of her own. Walls with windows wide enough to let in the light. Walls filled with laughter and love, freely given and freely received. The life I lived now was not the one I had once imagined. It was better. It was real. It was mine. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars blinked awake in the indigo sky, I lifted my teacup in a small, private toast. To Harold, to freedom, to beginnings, no matter how late they come, and to the quiet, stubborn joy of choosing yourself again and again until the choosing becomes a way of life.